The Atlantic Slave Trade, Part 4. Consequences of the slave trade. 1. It led to depopulation. The slave trade brought unaccessible disaster and misery to West Africa. It has been estimated that between 15 and 20 million West Africans were transported to America, and that about the same number again died during the slave hunting wars while waiting on the coast for shipment to America, and during the infamous Middle Passage, as the dreaded voyage from Africa to America was called. In other words, West Africa may have lost a total of 30 to 40 million people. European slave dealers were more ready to buy young men and women in good health. As a result, Africa was deprived of the most important portion of her productive manpower. The constant worrying occasioned by the slave raids led to insecurity of life and property, unnecessary shedding of blood, and general misery and unhappiness. Wars were waged not for self-preservation, nor for territorial expansion as in the old days of Mali and Songhai, but for sheer greed, the desire to get rich by capturing fellow human beings for sale. 2. The slaves' physical suffering. The slave trade brought intense suffering to the unfortunate slaves themselves. They were marched in chains to the coast, in the barcoons and forts, and they were stored under very unhealthy conditions while waiting for a ship to take them to America. And in the slave ships, they experienced even greater suffering, for manacled both hand and foot. They were packed like sardines, made to lie on their side for most of the voyage, and fed very scantily. Many slaves, brooding over their hard lot, jumped into the open Atlantic in order to put an end to a life that was no longer worth living. Occasionally, they revolted on board against their masters. But this made matters worse for the poor slaves because it compelled the European slave dealers to take extreme measures to ensure discipline during the voyage. Even in the American plantations, where they were finally sent, their fortunes were no better in place, where a slave could be flogged mercilessly and have his ear or arm lopped off for a very trifling offense. 3. The effect of slavery on industry and morale. Another effect of the trade was that it discouraged home industries. As we have seen already, West Africa had developed early many useful industries and handicrafts such as weaving, shoemaking, pottery, smithery, and bronze, and brass casting. Trade with Europe and America led to an influx into this part of Africa of foreign manufactured goods. Because these goods were cheaper and in some cases, but certainly not all, superior, West African kings, chiefs, and wealthy merchants preferred them to the homemade ones. The result was that industries declined from want of patronage. This accounts in part for the decline of Benin and Ile-Ife bronze arts and crafts. Agriculture too was disturbed by the incessant wars. It would appear, however, that the most permanent effect of the slave trade is the stigma of slavery. While all the other effects of this trade seem to have now disappeared, this one remains. It is this which explains in part the root of the present disharmony between the blacks and whites in many parts of the world today. As Dr. Nicholas Hans has rightly noted, with reference to America, it is the stigma of slavery which is so important in American relations, and not the color, intelligence, or character of an individual Negro. Even in Africa itself, there are areas where this social stigma still lingers on. But it's the long story of unmitigated suffering the only product of the slave trade? Amid all its evils, is there any long-term gain? There are very few events in human history which are entirely bad for mankind, and the slave trade is certainly not one of them, even though most of it was wrong and condemnable.